In this live session review, we'll look at and discuss a recent session where, when improving the path the hand's movement, so to be very precise, the hand path, how influential the hand path can be on some of the very intrinsic, almost hidden movements in many ways. So we have the very obvious, very kind of notable areas such as segment orientation and position, but sometimes it's the kind of the invisible segment movements, the ones we can't see. There's very deep intrinsic, what we call string dynamic values, which can often be hugely influenced by areas such as the hand path. So through this tutorial, let's look at and explore how improving the path the hands, especially in transition, move on relative to the path they go back on, how it can really be very influential around areas such as the interaction between, say, ribcage and lead arm, the rotational angle of body speeds, the length of hand path in downswing, and even then some of the forces that we're able to apply to the handle, especially as we start to move into an approach impact, can all very much be influenced and certainly improved by really then looking and exploring and in some ways changing and improving the hand path through swing. So on screen here we have the same player, in essence, start and end of session. On the left hand side, this window here, this is the player at the start of session. And on the right hand side, this window here, we have the player end session. So the active discussions through the player, through the coach in the session, really was improving the path the hands move on, especially in transition relative to the path they move back on. So let's initially start with looking at the path the hands move back on at the start of session. So playing the left hand image, the initial in some ways swing through to top of backswing and stop. You'll see the red line on screen here represents and displays the path the hands go back on, and then showing the initial move in downswing. We'll see how the yellow line or the orange line, depending on really how you wish to perceive this, is quite notably underneath or behind or inside, really depending on what reference or definition one wishes to use. But quite clearly the hand path is underneath or behind the path it goes back on, which is really represented by and certainly reflected by the orange path being underneath, as we would see things, the path it moves back on. Whereas looking now on the right hand side, let's take the player to top of backswing and stop. Once again, the red line represents the hand path in backswing. And you'll now see how much closer, how much more the hand path now tracks the path in downswing relative to the path it moved back on in backswing, which is really clearly shown by that yellow or orange line being much more precisely, much less displacement or variability in many ways. So in essence, the path the hands come down on are tracking much closer to the path they go back on. Even if you want to be really exploratory and very, very advanced now, you could certainly even improve this hand path significantly more, because it's not unusual to really kind of start to observe in very, very powerful, very highly skillful, established players, the hand path in downswing invariably and inevitably actually moves out or on top of or forward of the path it goes back on. But anyway, this is more of a live session review, and just to give a very clear, almost appreciation of, by improving the hand path movement in transition, often relative to the path that goes back on in backswing, can be really influential in a very, very advantageous way. Some of those kind of deep intrinsic movements, such as interaction between thorax and lead arm, and some of those forward values will come onto the second. And also one big thing we have to acknowledge here, almost as a caveat in many ways, much of this is absolutely controlled by the path the hands go back on. So someone goes a long way that way and still moves that way for sure. That can be a hand path outside of or in front of, but it may not be obviously helpful or advantageous. And equally so, someone may move that way in backswing, then move that way in transition, and actually provides very, very elastic, very, very helpful movements. So this is looking at it very much, we have to allow for and obviously very much appreciate the path in backswing. But even so, for the purpose of this tutorial, let's explore when improving that hand path in transition, obviously allowing for the path it goes back on, as you see here very clearly, how it can then connect back to some of those kind of deep intrinsic movements, such as thorax lead arm interaction, rotational body speeds, and some of the forces, the kinetic values in some ways that we produce in swing. So let's initially load up those force values. So we have on screen now the force values, or the center of mass forces and accelerations. And just to shorten the sequence of events, let's go to top of backswing and stop. If we now move the player on the left hand side, the pre-swing, when the hands are a long way underneath and behind them in downswing, and take them just to their impact value, which is just about here for this particular player. The real value of interest is the green value, the FZ force. In essence, how much force is moving up the shaft literally in this case, the frame before impact. So really what this really represents is how actively and almost how aggressively in a good way the player's pulling the handle up through impact, which we know can really then connect back to areas such as rotation and clubhead speed. So certainly in very, very powerful players, it's not unusual to see how actively the hands are pulling, almost kind of elevating the handle upwards and pulling the force up the shaft through impact. And that can really, like I said, represent back to areas such as rotation and clubhead speed. Equally so now, let's look at the play on the right-hand side with the improved hand path, the hand path tracking much closer to its path in backswing, and take them down to the exact same point at impact in downswing relative to the player on the left-hand side, the same player. This is obviously, by the way. You'll now see here how that FZ force is now much higher. It's 350 newtons. So you'll see here the Z value, the FZ value, 350 newtons versus 341. And also net force contribution is much greater now at 355 newtons relative to 344. So a very, very clear connection that often by improving the hand path in transition can correlate back to then having the ability or the capabilities in some ways to then really start to actively pull the handle upwards as you move into an approach impact. So then increasing how much force moves up the shaft, which we know can then associate back to areas such as improved rotation and clubhead speed. So let's now remove the force values and actually now start to look at some more of those very intrinsic values. In some ways, the interactions, the movements we can't see between the segments. So the real values of interest on screen now, you'll see in the top left-hand corner, so very much where the cursor is on my screen now, we have the peak angular rotational speeds of those main segments. So in this case, the pelvis, the thorax, the trail arm, the trail hand, and the club. So if we look at the top left-hand corner, the rotational speeds of the play at the start of session, and almost kind of do a comparable, we have a pelvis peak rotational speed of 368 degrees per second. However, on the right-hand side, when we improved the hand path, we had a pelvis rotational speed of 424 degrees per second. So a much more quicker, much more explosive, much faster peak pelvis rotational speed when the hand path is certainly tracking much closer in the downswing to the path it moved back on. We have a thorax speed of 425 degrees per second on the left-hand side relative to 456 degrees on the right-hand side.